Imagine a world where the horizon remains untouched by the hustle and bustle of centuries, and the first rays of the sun touch the earth like the gentle touch of the gods. Where not just cities, but entire worlds are born, where thoughts take shape and courage becomes legend. The sea breathes along the shores, bringing with it the salty taste of secrets, and the steppe stretches to the edge of the world, holding within itself the whisper of ancient winds. In this boundless space, shrouded in the mists of time, forces were born that would forever change the course of history. How could two such different, such powerful beginnings arise from the same land, from a single breath? Where lies the key to understanding this great duel, which determined the fate of nations for millennia to come? Somewhere there, at the crossroads of ancient roots, beneath the shade of olive trees among rocky hills, a great confrontation was brewing. The air was filled with the premonition of change. Every stone, every breath of the wind seemed to foretell the coming of an era when the mundane would give way to the heroic, and the struggle for ideals would become the meaning of life. The land, soaked in the sweat and blood of the first generations, was preparing to become the arena for battles that would be celebrated in song and legend. This was the dawn of two titans, a dawn that would ignite a light that would illuminate not only Hellas, but the entire future world. It was here, in this blessed land, where the sea merges with the sky and the mountains touch the stars, that what we today call civilization was born. A place where legends were born, where every stone holds the memory of great deeds, and where every sunset promises a new beginning. This is the beginning of a story that has not yet been written, but can already be felt in every breath of wind, in every sound of the surf. A story full of wisdom, courage, and passion, a story that began with the dawn of two great powers. Somewhere there, at the crossroads of ancient roots, beneath the shade of olive trees among rocky hills, a great confrontation was brewing. The air was filled with the premonition of change. Every stone, every breath of the wind seemed to foretell the coming of an era when the mundane would give way to the heroic, and the struggle for ideals would become the meaning of life. The land, soaked in the sweat and blood of the first generations, was preparing to become the arena for battles that would be celebrated in song and legend. This was the dawn of two titans, a dawn that would ignite a light that would illuminate not only Hellas, but the entire future world. It was here, in this blessed land where the sea merges with the sky and the mountains touch the stars, that what we today call civilization was born. A place where legends were born, where every stone holds the memory of great deeds, and where every sunset promises a new beginning. This is the beginning of a story that has not yet been written, but can already be felt in every breath of wind, in every sound of the surf. A story full of wisdom, courage, and passion, a story that began with the dawn of two great powers. Now let us pause at the walls of the city that grew on Attica, Athens. Its very name echoes wisdom and strength. It is not just a settlement, it is a living organism, beating to the rhythm of thousands of hearts. Here, among white marble temples reaching toward the sun and narrow streets where shadows intertwine, something was born that changed the world forever. Democracy. A word that still rings in our heads like a bell calling for freedom. Imagine the agora, the heart of the city. Not just a marketplace, but a place where every citizen, be they artisan, philosopher, or military leader, had a voice. The sun bathes it in gold, reflecting off bronze statues and white stone. The air is filled with the hubbub of the crowd, debates, laughter, and singing. Here, ideas were born that, like seeds, spread throughout the Mediterranean, taking root in people's souls. Here, on this land, man first realized his own value, his right to participate in the control of his own destiny. Athens was not only the cradle of politics, it became an altar of thought. Philosophers, those wanderers in search of truth, wandered the streets, gathering in the shade of plane trees or on the steps of temples, Socrates with his eternal questions, Plato with his ideal world of forms, Aristotle with his desire to order all that exists. Their words, like rays of light, pierced the darkness of ignorance, illuminating the paths of knowledge. They taught not only how to live, but also how to think, how to see the world not only as it is, but also as it could be. Art. Oh, the art of Athens! It breathed life. Sculptors sculpted gods and heroes, imbuing marble with movement and passion. Architects erected the Parthenon, that crowning achievement, which still amazes with its harmony and grandeur. Every line, every detail, like a song engraved in stone. A theatre where tragedy and comedy intertwined, making audiences laugh and cry, reflect on good and evil, fate and freedom. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, their voices still resonate in our souls, reminding us of eternal human passions. Athens was a city of contrasts. Here, under the canopy of wisdom and beauty, a vibrant life unfolded. Citizens debated, voted, and made decisions. The sea that washed the shores of Attica brought not only goods but also news of distant lands and new challenges. This city possessed both pride and self-confidence, sometimes bordering on arrogance. After all, they considered themselves the pinnacle of human development, a light destined to illuminate the entire world. But this light, so bright and alluring, could not exist in a vacuum. It attracted attention, aroused admiration, and even envy. Athens, with its democracy, philosophy, and art, became a beacon to which many aspired, but which could also become a target for those who saw its light as a threat. Here, in this city, where every stone breathed history, the foundations of the future were laid, but also the storms to come were foretold. Attica, the cradle of civilization, was preparing for trials that would test the strength of everything it had created. But where the Athenian light spread like a golden river in the shady valleys of the Peloponnese, something else was born. Something forged in the harsh mountain winds and the barren soil that provided only the bare necessities. This was Sparta. Not a city in the traditional sense, with bustling agoras and graceful temples. Sparta was more like a camp, a fortress reaching for eternity. Here they didn't sing odes to beauty. Here they taught survival. A Spartan's entire life was subordinated to a single goal, creating the perfect warrior. From birth, as soon as an infant uttered its first cry, it was examined. The weak and incapable were condemned to abandonment. It was cruel, but the Spartans believed that this was how they strengthened their tribe, cutting away all that was superfluous, everything that could weaken them in the battles to come. Boys left their father's home at the age of 7. Their lives began in the Agorge, a harsh school where every day was a battle. They were taught to endure pain, hunger, and cold. They were taught to be obedient, disciplined, and fearless. They slept on hard straw mats, ate meager food, often foraging for it themselves. Their clothing was simple and coarse. Luxury wasn't just undesirable, it was an enemy that could distract from what was most important. Their bodies were bronzed by the sun and hardened by training. Their spirits were steel. The word freedom had a special meaning in Sparta. It wasn't freedom of choice, not freedom of speech. It was freedom from fear, freedom from weakness, freedom to serve the state, which was everything. Women in Sparta occupied a special position. They were not forbidden from participating in sports. They were strong and healthy. After all, the birth of future Spartans depended on them. They knew no domestic slavery. They were taught to manage the household while the men were at war. But their role was also subordinated to a primary goal. They were the mothers of warriors. They were proud to hear, "Your son died defending the fatherland." This was the highest recognition. Spartan society was built on the foundation of a strict hierarchy. At the top were the Spartiates, full-fledged citizens and warriors. Below them were the Perioeci, free citizens, artisans and merchants who lacked political rights. And at the very bottom were the Helots, slaves who worked the land on which the Spartans lived. They far outnumbered the Spartans and were a constant source of turmoil. The most brutal measures were used to keep them in line. A secret police force, the Cryptiae, composed of young Spartans, carried out nightly raids on the Helots, killing the strongest and most daring. Fear was a constant companion for the Helots, and it was fear that underpinned the entire Spartan system. Every Spartan was part of a single mechanism. Personal ambitions, desires and feelings all took a backseat to duty to the state. Their renowned brevity of speech, their laconicism, was more than just a character trait. It was a demonstration that words must be precise, as weighty as a spear thrust. Fewer words, more action. But behind this outward severity, behind this iron discipline, lurked a secret that inspired admiration in some and fear in others. The Spartans did not build magnificent buildings nor create works of art that would endure the centuries. Their art was life itself, the system itself. Their ideal was a perfect society where everyone knew their place and fulfilled their role, a society capable of withstanding any threat. It was a society based on self-restraint, on the rejection of anything that might soften the spirit. Their food was simple, their clothing coarse, their dwellings modest. No excesses, no luxuries. All resources went to the army, to maintaining order. Their only goal was to maintain their dominance and defend their borders. However, in this rigid system where everyone was a cog in a vast machine, there was also a form of harmony. Harmony born of order, of predictability. Everyone knew what was required of them, and everyone knew that the same was required of others. This created a sense of solidity, of immutability. It was precisely this inner strength, this warrior spirit, this iron discipline that made Sparta a formidable force, a force that could withstand any enemy, a force that inspired fear. Against the backdrop of luxurious Athens with its philosophy and art, Sparta seemed like another world, a world where order reigned, where strength and duty ruled. A world that was preparing for its hour, for its test. And this hour, oddly enough, was destined to come because of those very Athens that seemed so distant and dissimilar. Two worlds, two ideals, two paths that were inevitably destined to collide. In the shadows of the mountains where the wind sang its harsh songs, a force was brewing that would change the course of history. A force that did not strive for beauty, but achieved perfection in its own way. A force that was preparing for a battle where the fate of the entire Hellenic world would be decided. Sparta, a land of warriors, a land of discipline, a land of mystery, stood on the threshold of great achievements, and the entire world stood still, anticipating the coming changes. A change of era approaches like a breath of wind across the steppe. Somewhere to the east, beyond the blue seas and distant mountains, an empire was growing in power, its shadow stretching from the Nile to the Indus. The Persian Empire, a kingdom of kings where gold flowed like rivers and armies seemed countless, like stars in the night sky, slowly turned its gaze westward toward the small but proud cities of the Greeks. It was a state built on power, on submission, on ancient traditions. Its rulers, seated on ivory thrones, viewed the world as their property and other peoples as their servants. Persia had its own order, its own majestic rhythm. The whispers of courtiers, the clink of gold, the clatter of the hooves of thousands of horses racing along the royal roads, all this created a sense of power and immutability. The great king, ruler of all lands, was the embodiment of divine will. His word was law, his command was destiny. But this vast, glittering machine seemed to know no bounds to its ambition. Its appetite for power, for new lands, for new riches, grew with each passing year. And so this wave, rolling from the east, reached the shores of Hellas. The Greeks, fragmented into numerous city-states, each with its own laws, its own gods, its own pride, found themselves facing an unprecedented threat. The Persian Empire, united under the rule of Darius and then his son Xerxes, began its invasion. This was more than just a conquest. It was a clash of two worlds, two completely different concepts of life, of freedom, of man's place in the world. The Persians brought with them their culture, their customs, their faith. They wanted the Greeks to bow their heads, to acknowledge the authority of the King of Kings, to pay tribute. But the Greeks, even the smallest and poorest city-states, knew the value of their independence. They valued their freedom above all else. They were ready to fight for every inch of land, for every stone of their temples, for the right to decide their own destiny. The first sparks of this great conflict flared in the lands of Asia Minor, where Greek cities under Persian rule rose in revolt. Athens, not yet having reached its golden age but already proud of its democracy, supported the rebels. It was a bold decision, challenging the powerful king. Persia could not tolerate this. Revenge was inevitable. And so, fleets of thousands and countless armies moved west. The air filled with anxiety. The wind seemed to whisper of impending battles. The Greeks, accustomed to infighting and petty skirmishes, suddenly saw before them an enemy that could devour them all. At that moment, as the shadow of Persian domination loomed over Hellas, something astonishing happened. The disparate city-states, so often at odds with one another, began to unite. A common enemy, a common fear, a common threat. All this became the glue that began to bind the disparate parts of the Greek world together. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, cities that only yesterday had viewed each other with suspicion, now had to find common ground. It wasn't easy. The Spartans, with their military discipline, were prepared for land battles. The Athenians, with their growing navy, saw their future in naval power. But in the face of the Persian threat, these differences faded. The initial clashes were brutal. The Battle of Marathon, where a small force of Athenians led by Miltiades halted the formidable Persian army, became legendary. It was a miracle born of courage, of faith in their own strength, of the knowledge that the entire Hellenic world stood behind them. That day, the Greeks proved that even in the face of overwhelming odds, victory could be achieved if one fought for freedom. Then came the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans under the command of King Leonidas, along with other allies, bore the brunt of the entire Persian army. They fought to the last man, becoming a symbol of self-sacrifice and heroism. Their feat, mourned throughout the Hellenic world, inspired further struggle. More battles followed. The naval battle of Salamis, where the Athenian fleet under Themistocles achieved a decisive victory over the Persians, marked a turning point. The waves crashing against the ships, the cries of warriors, the cracking of wood, all became part of the great drama. The Persian army, deprived of naval support, was forced to retreat. The Greco-Persian wars were more than just a series of battles. It was a time when the Greeks recognized their community, their strength, their uniqueness. They saw that their democracy, their philosophy, their art were not mere whims, but the foundation of their civilization, something worth fighting for. A common enemy, while creating rivals, paradoxically contributed to their unification, strengthening their spirit. In this confrontation, in this trial by fire, a new Hellas was born, ready for its golden age. A new chapter in the ancient world opens before us. After the thunder of battle, after the Persian threat has receded, Athens, forged in the crucible of struggle, enters its golden age. The air above the city, so recently filled with anxiety, now seems permeated with the scent of roses and wisdom. The sun, gently illuminating the white marble buildings, seems to bless this flowering. This is the time when the great strategist and orator Pericles, like a skilled helmsman, steers his ship, the Athenian state, through calm but fertile waters. His voice, like music, captivates listeners in the agora. His words, like seeds, fall into fertile soil, giving birth to new ideas, new aspirations. Pericles, a man of exceptional intelligence and unwavering will, became the embodiment of this era. He understood that the true strength of Athens lay not only in its navy but also in its citizens, in their freedom of thought, in their pursuit of perfection. He gave democracy a new lease of life, making it accessible to anyone willing to assume responsibility for the fate of the polis. Life on the Acropolis itself changed. Stones, so recently silent witnesses to war, now came to life under the sculptor's chisel. The Parthenon, a majestic temple dedicated to the goddess Athena, became the embodiment of this triumph. Its columns, slender and powerful, soar into the blue sky like a hymn to beauty and harmony. Friezes decorated with intricate carvings told the stories of gods and heroes, reminding everyone where the Athenians came from and what they aspired to. Every stone, every ray of light falling on the marble seemed part of a grand design. This wasn't just construction, it was creation. Architects, sculptors, and artists all labored, inspired by the idea of perfection. Their hands, which had recently held weapons, now created masterpieces that would delight the ages. The spirit of Hellenic thought, free and indomitable, found expression in these creations. Philosophers, sitting in the shade of olive trees, conducted their conversations, exploring the mysteries of existence, human nature, and the laws of the universe. Their dialogues, recorded by their students, became the foundation of Western philosophy. Socrates, wise and enigmatic, walked the streets of Athens, asking questions that forced people to reflect on themselves and their beliefs. Plato, his student, developed these ideas, creating his teachings on the world of ideas and the perfect state. Aristotle, another great thinker, systematized knowledge, laying the foundations of logic, ethics, and politics. Tragedies and comedies were performed in the theatres of Athens. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, their plays, full of profound meaning, made audiences laugh and cry, pondering the eternal questions of life and death, fate and freedom. These performances were more than just entertainment. They were part of public life, a way to understand the world and educate citizens. The rhythm of life in Athens became more measured, but no less intense. The morning noise of the market, where merchants offered their wares, mingled with the quiet footsteps of philosophers hurrying to conversation. In the evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in golden and purple hues, the streets filled with laughter and music. Athenian democracy, tested and tested, became a benchmark. Citizens participated in governance, made decisions, and bore responsibility. It was an experiment, bold and daring, but it demonstrated what society is capable of when everyone feels part of the whole. Pericles, speaking to the people, spoke of the greatness of Athens, its role in the world, and its responsibility to the future. His words were filled with pride, but also with an understanding of the fragility of what had been achieved. He knew that the world does not stand still, that every triumph can be followed by a trial. During this period of prosperity, art and science reached unprecedented heights. Sculptors created statues that seemed lifelike, so accurately did they convey human anatomy and emotions. Artists decorated temples and buildings, creating vibrant frescoes depicting scenes from myths and everyday life. Poets composed verses extolling the beauty of nature, the valor of heroes and love. Mathematicians and astronomers made discoveries, expanding the boundaries of knowledge. Euclid, Hippocrates, Herodotus, their names will forever remain etched in history. Athens became a magnet for people from across the Hellenic world. Scholars, artists, philosophers, and artisans flocked here, drawn by the city's opportunities and atmosphere. It was a melting pot of ideas, a place where the new was born and the old reimagined. The Golden Age of Athens is more than just a period in history. It is a symbol of what humanity can achieve when it thinks freely, strives for excellence, and believes in its own strength. It is a time when the light of Hellenic thought brightly illuminated the world, leaving an indelible mark on culture and civilization. And so, as the Parthenon shone in the sun and the agora hummed with the voices of its citizens, it seemed as if this golden age would last forever. And so, as the Parthenon shone in the sun's rays and the agora hummed with the voices of its citizens, it seemed as if this golden age would last forever. But somewhere in the south, where the lands were parched by the sun and the mountains were harsh, another force was awakening. The wind blew over the Peloponnese, carrying the scent of iron and endurance. Sparta, a city carved from stone and will, looked upon towering Athens with undisguised skepticism. Where Athenian squares sang of freedom and wisdom, Spartan barracks filled with the clang of weapons and the strict, monotonous rhythm of training. Sparta didn't build temples like the Parthenon, nor did it adorn itself with statues of gods and heroes. Its only monument was man, the ideal warrior. Every boy, barely able to walk, became part of a system that shaped body and spirit with ruthless consistency. Agoge, that was the name of this educational system. No softness, no mercy. Cold, hunger, pain, these were the first teachers. Literacy was minimal. The emphasis was on mastery of the sword, spear, and shield. Every gesture, every word, every glance, everything was subordinated to a single goal: service to the state. They lived simply, almost ascetically. Their food was meager, their clothing coarse. Luxury was an enemy, and individuality a suspect aberration. A Spartan's entire life was predetermined from the moment of birth. Unlucky infants, weak or sick, were abandoned on the summit of Mount Taygetos to allow nature to take its course. It was harsh, but from the Spartans' perspective, necessary. Only the strong, the resilient, the able to endure hardships could serve as the eternal support of the state. Women in Sparta enjoyed more freedom than in Athens. They weren't kept locked up, they exercised, strengthening their bodies to bear healthy children, future warriors. But their lives too were subordinated to one goal, the continuation of the Spartan bloodline. There was no art, no philosophy, except that which forged character. Their songs were battle hymns, their dances a mock battle. The Spartan system was unique. It created an army that knew no fear, an army for whom death in battle was the highest honor. Their famous phalanx, a closed formation of shields and spears, was virtually impregnable. Every warrior knew his place, each felt the support of a comrade nearby. They didn't just fight together, they lived together, they died together. But this iron discipline had its downside. Spartan society was closed and conservative. Any innovation was viewed with suspicion. Their economy was based on the labor of helots, enslaved farmers who tilled the land and fed their masters. Helots constituted the overwhelming majority of the population, and fear of their rebellion was a constant companion for the Spartans. This fear perhaps fueled their desire for military might, for absolute power over themselves and others. As Athens flourished, basking in the golden light of its golden age, Sparta bided its time. It watched as Athenian democracy, with its freedom of speech and openness, attracted ever more attention. It saw the Athenian navy dominate the seas, its influence spreading throughout the Hellenic world. And this evoked not admiration, but a deep, cold irritation. The Spartans considered the Athenians weak, frivolous, and prone to excess. They saw their art and philosophy as mere empty words, their democracy as chaos. Their own path, the path of strength, order, and absolute submission, seemed the only true one. And so they began to prepare. Prepared to show the world that true power lies not in gold and art, but in steel and discipline. Gradually, like a premonition of an approaching storm, tensions between the two great powers grew. Sparta perceived every step Athens took as a challenge, every new Athenian naval victory as a personal insult. There was no open war between them, but the air was thick with suspicion, intrigue, and mutual hostility. It was a time when two completely different worlds, the two poles of Hellenic civilization, were increasingly drawn toward each other, foreshadowing an inevitable clash. Athens, blinded by its own splendor, seemed oblivious to the approaching shadow. They continued to build, create, and conduct their affairs, confident in the inviolability of their position. But beneath the surface of calm, waves were already building, ready to crash down upon them with inexorable force. Sparta, meanwhile, patiently and methodically strengthened its ranks, preparing to reveal its iron fist to the world. And that moment approached, like a breath of wind across the endless steppe, bringing with it change. A silence, thick and palpable, like the harbinger of an approaching storm, enveloped the world of the Hellenic city-states. Time seemed to slow, but beneath this deceptive surface, tension was building. Athens, intoxicated by its own brilliance, continued to weave the patterns of its democracy, erecting majestic temples where every stone breathed art and thought. Its ships, like swift swallows, cut through the blue sea, carrying trade and influence far beyond the borders of Attica. The Golden Age seemed never-ending. But in the shadow of the Acropolis, in the austere barracks of Sparta, a different feeling was brewing. The Spartans, whose lives were forged of steel and discipline, viewed Athenian splendor with cold suspicion. Theirs was a world of order, where every step was measured and every word carried weight. They saw in Athenian freedom only anarchy, in their art, idle whimsy. Their path, the path of the warrior, the path of duty, seemed to them the only true one. And this path led them to inevitable confrontation. There was no open war between the two titans, but the air was thick with invisible threads of hostility. Every Athenian gesture, every new alliance, every naval victory was perceived by Sparta as a challenge, an attack on their own harsh way of life. City-states where brotherhood once reigned were now rife with suspicion and intrigue. Minor skirmishes, local conflicts, disputes over trade routes or influence over smaller city-states, all these were merely echoes, harbingers of the coming thunder. Corinth, a mighty trading centre whose ships plied the seas no less than those of Athens, began to feel the pressure. Its economic interests were closely intertwined with those of Athens, but its ruling circles increasingly leaned toward Sparta, fearing Athenian dominance. The Corinthian navy, always formidable, began to play a more active role, provoking the Athenians and disrupting their trade routes. These were not mere trade disputes, they were a geopolitical game where every concession, every refusal of a demand was perceived as weakness. Far from the sea, deep in the Peloponnese, Messenia, once conquered and enslaved, was raising its head. Sparta, which controlled these lands, brutally suppressed any sign of dissent. But hunger and injustice bred anger, and anger, like smouldering coals, waited for its time. Rumors of uprisings and secret gatherings of Messenians reached Athens, and some Athenian politicians saw this as an opportunity to weaken Sparta and support the oppressed. This was another thread in the complex web of tensions, another reason for Sparta to consider Athens its enemy. Boeotia, whose fertile lands bordered Attica, had always been torn by internal conflicts. Thebes, its capital, periodically sought alliances with both Athens and Sparta, attempting to capitalize on their rivalry. But during this period, under the influence of Spartan agents, Thebes increasingly leaned toward the anti-Athenian coalition. Its hoplites, seasoned in countless internecine wars, constituted a formidable force, and their defection to Sparta could have shifted the balance of power. Athens, for its part, did not sit idly by. Its skilled and eloquent diplomats travelled throughout the Hellenic world, attempting to strengthen their alliances and secure the support of their allies. They offered protection, trade privileges, and shared the fruits of their golden age. But many city-states, especially those under direct Spartan influence, refused the Athenian overtures, fearing Spartan wrath. More open clashes also occurred. Rebellions broke out on the Aegean islands, whose fate often depended on naval supremacy. Cities that had once been part of the Delian League sought to break free from Athenian control, and Sparta, unable to challenge the Athenian navy at sea, supported these rebellions with its land forces, penetrating the islands via short sea voyages. Athenian governors, attempting to suppress these rebellions, clashed with Spartan allied forces, and these skirmishes, though localized, were the harbingers of a major war. At this time, when the world stood frozen in anticipation, art and philosophy in Athens continued their flight. Artists created masterpieces, playwrights staged tragedies in which heroes confronted fate and destiny. And these works, oddly enough, reflected the mounting tension. They rang with notes of doubt, fear of the unknown, and warnings about the fragility of the world. But blinded by their own grandeur, the Athenians did not always see the true depth of these omens. Sparta, on the other hand, grew increasingly united and resolute. Its laws, its education, its culture were geared toward preparing for war. Every Spartan, great and small, knew their role in the coming conflict. Their society, like a well-oiled machine, was preparing for the onset of war. And so between these two poles, democratic Athens and oligarchic Sparta, between gold and steel, between philosophy and discipline, a conflict was growing. This was not simply a struggle for power, it was a clash of two worlds, two ideologies, two paths of development. Minor skirmishes, diplomatic maneuvers, trade wars, all these were merely links in a single chain leading to the inevitable. The harbinger of a storm was palpable in every rustle, every whisper, every glance cast across the border. The world of the Hellenic city-state stood still, breathing deeply, the air saturated with the scent of coming change. And no one knew that these changes would come at such a high price. The time was approaching when on the dusty roads of Hellas, where every stone held the memory of past battles, two great powers would clash. Like two gigantic trees with roots stretching back to antiquity, Athens and Sparta stood on the threshold of a decisive clash. The wind, which had previously merely rustled through olive groves and fluttered the sails of ships, now carried the premonition of a storm. The air grew thicker, saturated with the scent of salt from the sea and dust from the plains. Myths that had lived for centuries in the songs of storytellers and on temple frescoes were about to take on flesh and blood on the battlefields. Athens, washed by sun and sea breezes, shone in its golden age. Its acropolis soaring toward the azure sky was not just a city but a center of thought, art, and freedom. Democracy, like a fragile flower, blossomed here, granting every citizen the right to vote. Philosophers, like wise gardeners, nurtured the seeds of reason, and playwrights, like skillful weavers, wove patterns of human destinies on the theatre stage. The Parthenon, Athena's majestic temple, was a symbol of this flowering where every stone, every column spoke of harmony and perfection. Here, in the shadow of marble porticos, debates about justice, the nature of existence, and man's place in the universe resounded. The Athenians believed in the power of their minds, the invincibility of their navy, and their right to lead the entire Hellenic world. Their ships, fast and graceful, plied the seas, bringing trade, culture, and, of course, power. But nearby, hidden in the depths of the Peloponnese, stood Sparta, not a city, but a fortress of spirit, forged of iron and discipline. Its inhabitants, the Lacedaemonians, were trained from childhood in the art of war. Every boy, after a harsh upbringing, became a warrior, ready to give his life for his homeland. Their society was like a monolithic shield, where every citizen was a cog in a single mechanism designed to maintain order and power. The Spartans knew no luxury, no excesses. Their lives were subordinated to duty, honor, and the impeccable execution of orders. They disdained the refinement of the Athenians, considering it weakness. Their strength lay in unity, endurance, and indomitable will. Their phalanx, a closed wall of shields and spears, was a formidable force before which enemies trembled. The Greco-Persian wars, which had once united the Greeks in the face of a common enemy, were now but a distant echo. The common threat had passed, and in its place came mutual distrust, which grew into open rivalry. Athens, having become the leader of the Delian League, gathered numerous city-states around itself, turning them into its own domain. The gold that flowed into the treasury from the allied lands fueled the ambitions of the Athenians, allowing them to build new temples, new ships, and new walls. Pericles, wise and far-sighted, ruled the city, directing its energy toward prosperity and glory. It seemed that nothing could shake this greatness. But Sparta, unwilling to see Athenian dominance, began to gather its forces. Its influence grew among the Peloponnesian states, dissatisfied with Athenian hegemony. Fear of Athenian power, wealth, and cultural superiority became a unifying factor for the Spartan allies. Sparta, with its iron discipline and unwavering will, represented a force capable of challenging the Athenian Golden Age. Tensions were rising like the air before a storm. Minor skirmishes, border disputes, trade conflicts, all these were merely echoes of the coming storm. Diplomats traveled back and forth trying to find a compromise, but their words were drowned out by the growing din of discontent. Athens, blinded by its success, failed to see the full depth of the abyss that had opened beneath it. Sparta, on the contrary, grew ever more resolute. Its warriors, seasoned in battle, were ready for the clash. The breath of wind across the steppe, which had previously brought only coolness, now whispered of inevitability. The world froze in anticipation. And then, when the first rays of sun colored the horizon, it became clear a great confrontation was coming. The Peloponnesian War, a battle where myths and legends would become reality, where the fate of Hellas would be decided on the battlefield. It was a clash of two worlds, two ideologies, two paths of development, which would change the course of history forever. No one knew that this day would mark the beginning of the end of a golden age, but the beginning of a new, tragic chapter. Athens, once a shining star, the heart of Hellas, felt the cold wind of change brush against its golden rooftops. The previously clear sky began to thicken with grey clouds, foreshadowing a storm. The great Peloponnesian War, which had begun as a power struggle, a clash of two worlds, was gathering momentum, revealing wounds that seemed incurable. At first, it seemed like just another test, similar to those Athens had endured before, emerging even stronger. But this war was different. It carried within itself the seeds of destruction germinating in the very soul of the city. The mighty navy, the pride of Athens, which had conquered the seas, now became its gravedigger. The Battle of Sicily, an ambitious plan that promised unprecedented greatness, turned into a disaster. The enormous triremes, once swiftly cutting through the waves, now lay on the seabed like broken toys, their masts jutting out of the water like tombstones. The water, usually gentle and friendly, became ominous, reflecting a sky clouded with ash and fear. Thousands of warriors, the finest sons of Athens, perished there, in foreign waters, their cries lost in the roar of the elements and the clash of enemy weapons. This was more than just a lost battle. It was a bloodbath that drained the city of its strength and confidence. As if by a twist of fate, as Athens mourned her sons, another scourge struck the city. Plague, an invisible enemy, ignoring wealth or poverty, glory or shame, began its march through streets suffocated by heat and despair. From the bustle and noise of the port districts, the disease spread with alarming speed. It penetrated homes, temples, and the very hearts of families. The smell of death became a constant companion. The streets, once filled with laughter and the sound of footsteps, now resounded with groans and the quiet rustle of shuffling feet. Those who had recently strode proudly to the sound of flutes and cymbals now fell, exhausted, their eyes blazing and breathing heavily. Neither medicine nor prayer could stop it. Death had become part of everyday life. The physician who had treated kings yesterday lay on his bed today, lost to oblivion. A father watched his son die, powerless to do anything. Friends who had sworn eternal fidelity now avoided each other, fearing contagion. The atmosphere of the city changed. Gone was the ease of being, the confidence in the future that had always distinguished Athens. In its place, fear took root, cold and penetrating. And along with the plague, along with the destruction of the fleet, disillusionment began to grow in the hearts of the Athenians. Disillusionment with the ideals they had cherished for so long. Democracy, which had seemed the pinnacle of human perfection, now seemed fragile and incapable of coping with adversity. Philosophy, meant to illuminate the path, seemed powerless in the face of death and suffering. Art, which had celebrated beauty and harmony, now evoked only bitter smirks. Where were the gods when their children perished in the seas and on the streets? Where was the wisdom that should have guided them to prosperity? Voices that once rang with conviction now seemed empty. Words that once inspired now evoked only disbelief. People began to doubt everything that formed the foundation of their lives. It seemed as if the city itself, once a bastion of civilization, was slowly plunging into darkness. The wind that once carried the scent of flowers from the Acropolis now carried only the scent of disease and ash. The quiet whisper of the sea off the shores of Piraeus, once a reminder of power and freedom, now sounded like a mournful song. The shadows lengthened, consuming the vibrant colors of life. Athens, the city that had given so much to the world, now needed saving itself. And that salvation was not coming. Warriors returning from the battlefields carried with them not only wounds, but also the bitterness of defeat. Their armor, once gleaming, was covered in dust and blood. Their faces, once full of courage, now expressed weariness and devastation. They saw their comrades fall, their dreams shattered, and this left an indelible mark on their souls. Houses that had once been filled with laughter and music now stood empty or were filled with silence. Women who had been waiting for their husbands and sons now mourned them, their tears mingling with the dust of the roads. Children who had once played in the squares now sat by the windows, their eyes filled with fear and confusion. Even the Parthenon, the eternal symbol of Athenian glory, seemed to look upon all this with sadness. Its marble columns towering over the city now served not only as a testament to grandeur, but also as a silent reproach. The gods depicted on its friezes seemed distant and indifferent to the suffering of mortals. Athens, once a shining beacon guiding other nations, was now losing its light. Internal strife, fueled by despair and fear, weakened the city even further. Soldiers, weary of war, lost faith in their ideals. Citizens, bereaved, lost faith in justice. This loss of faith was perhaps the most terrible consequence of the war. When ideals crumble, when faith fades, only emptiness remains. And in this emptiness it's easy to lose oneself, to lose one's way. Athens, having lost its fleet and its sons, had also lost a part of its soul. The city that proudly carried the banner of democracy and culture now stood on the brink of collapse, weak and vulnerable. The air over Athens was heavy, permeated with the scent of sickness and sorrow. The silence, once a symbol of peace, was now ominous. Everything stood still before a storm that had already passed, leaving only ashes and pain in its wake. It seemed as if the golden age had truly come to an end, and only a long, dark night lay ahead. But even in the darkest times, history remembers. And the memory of greatness, of decline, of struggle, that too is part of our heritage. The silence that enveloped the once bustling Athenian squares was unsettling. It carried echoes of pain and disappointment, like fear lurking in the shadows. The majestic columns of the Parthenon, illuminated by the dim setting sun, seemed bowed in mournful silence. The democracy born here had encountered the harsh realities of war, and its ideals, seemingly indestructible, were wounded. The gods, engraved in marble, seemed to have turned away, leaving mortals alone with their grief. The air was thick, permeated with the scent of sickness and loss. The city, which had recently been the center of the Hellenic world, now looked tired and haggard. The wind blowing across its hills carried only the whispers of defeat. But history abhors a vacuum. Where the light of one luminary faded, another inevitably began to glow. Athens, weakened, lay in the shadows, but it was only a moment, a brief pause before a new chapter. Sparta, whose life had always been governed by the strict laws of discipline and military valor, now saw its chance. Its warriors, seasoned in battle, accustomed to hardship, knew no fatigue in the Athenian sense. For them, war was not a tragedy, but a natural state, a path to greatness. After decades of grueling struggle, when Athens seemed to hold the fate of the entire Greek world in its hands, the scales tipped. The Peloponnesian War, that titanic clash between the two poles of Hellenic civilization, left deep scars. Athens, once resplendent with its navy and wealth, was broken. Its naval power, a source of pride and an instrument of dominance, was destroyed. The plague that devastated the city claimed the lives of thousands, including Pericles himself, whose common sense and leadership had so long kept Athens from making fatal mistakes. The disillusionment with ideals, with faith in justice and victory undermined, proved no less devastating than any battle. And so the moment arrived when Sparta, always overshadowed by Athenian splendor, came to the fore. Its hegemony, long awaited and hard won, seemed unshakable. 40 years had passed since the war ended, but its echoes still resounded in the hearts of the Greeks. Spartan warriors, with their stern faces and inscrutable gazes, now became the arbiters of fate. Cities that had once stood proudly under the banner of Athens now looked with alarm at the Spartan garrisons that were appearing everywhere. But this triumph was short-lived, fragile as ice on spring water. The Spartan system, built on discipline and repression, offered nothing but order based on fear. Its laws were harsh, its society insular. The warrior spirit that had sustained it for so long proved incapable of governing the world in peacetime. The Spartans were masters of war, but not of diplomacy. They knew how to conquer, but they knew no creation. Their hegemony was based not on attraction, but on force. Discontent grew in the cities subject to Sparta. Athens, though defeated, remained a symbol of free thought and cultural flourishing. Their ideas, their art, their philosophy lived on, penetrating the veil of Spartan power. Throughout Hellas, whispers of Athens' former greatness and of a democracy that gave every citizen a voice were circulated. The Spartan system, at its core, was the antithesis of what it had conquered. It offered neither inspiration nor new horizons. Its reign was like a long, harsh winter when nature freezes but does not die. Warriors whose lives were dedicated to battle proved unprepared for the role of builders. Their methods, effective on the battlefield, became intolerable in peacetime. In cities where the arts and sciences had once flourished, an atmosphere of wariness now reigned. Trade slowed and communication became cautious. Every step, every word could be interpreted as a challenge. The Spartan governors appointed to govern conquered city-states were often rude and impatient, lacking understanding of the subtleties of local life. They brought order, but this order was cold and heartless. The Spartan system itself, so effective in a climate of constant warfare, began to crack under the weight of the new situation. The Helots, the oppressed farmers who formed the backbone of the Spartan economy, felt the weakening of Spartan control and began to dream of freedom. The ephors, the overseers whose power had been immense, were now faced with the need to govern not only their fellow citizens, but entire nations. Tensions rose like water before a dam. Sparta's hegemony, which had begun as a triumph, was becoming a burden. It required constant control, constant suppression, which drained Sparta's resources and strength. Warrior spirit, once their greatest weapon, was now becoming a liability. Instead of seeking new paths of development, the Spartans clung to the old order, fearing change. It was a time when the world seemed to be frozen in anticipation. The silence that enveloped Greece was not calm, but tense anticipation. Sparta, reveling in its brief moment of dominance, failed to see the abyss yawning beneath its feet. Its victory, won at such a high price, proved to be only a prelude to new upheavals. In cities that had once admired Athenian culture, a new generation was growing up, one that had never known the luxury of the Golden Age but remembered its humiliation. Their hearts were filled with resentment and a desire to reclaim their lost freedom. Spartan discipline, designed to ensure order, only intensified this desire for change. The sun, breaking through the clouds, illuminated fields once drenched in blood, now overgrown with grass. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees as if telling ancient tales of glory and fall. History, as always, moved forward despite attempts to stop it. Spartan hegemony, that bright but brief moment of triumph, carried within itself the seed of its own destruction. Its fragility was obvious to those who could see beyond, who sensed the breath of change. Athens, though defeated, lived on in memory and ideas. Its legacy, invisible yet powerful, reached the farthest corners of Greece. Sparta, however, though strong in the moment, proved incapable of adapting to a changing world. Its rule was like trying to hold water in a sieve. Tensions were mounting. Minor skirmishes that had previously seemed insignificant now took on new meaning. Every uprising, every rebellion was a harbinger of a coming storm. The Spartan rulers, steeped in their traditions, failed to notice how peace was slipping from their grasp. They saw only enemies to be crushed, but failed to notice the new forces gaining strength. The history of Sparta, like that of Athens, was full of grandeur and tragedy. But precisely at the moment when it seemed one power had reached its apogee, another began its journey. The silence that enveloped Greece after the Peloponnesian War was merely a lull before a new, even greater confrontation. Sparta, having achieved its hegemony, found itself trapped by its own power, unable to move forward, unable to understand that the time for change was inexorable. Its triumph was merely a reprieve, a brief interruption in the eternal dance of history. And somewhere in the shadows, new forces were already maturing, ready to challenge the established order. The Peloponnesian War left deep scars on the body of Hellas. Sparta, having emerged victorious, found itself in a strange position. Its iron discipline, so effective on the battlefield, was unable to govern the disparate city-states. Each city-state, sensing the hegemon's weakness, began to pull the blanket over itself. Athens, humiliated but not broken, watched from the shadows. Their time had not yet come, but the seeds of rebirth were already taking root. Cities, exhausted by war, sought new support, new meaning. It was at this moment that a new player emerged on the historical stage. From the north, from lands previously considered the periphery of the Greek world, a power no one expected was advancing: Macedonia, a country whose culture and traditions differed from the sophistication of the southern city-states. But its rulers, men of ambition and iron will, saw opportunity where others saw only chaos. Philip II, King of Macedonia, was a man whose name would soon resound throughout Greece. He was not Greek in the same sense as the Athenians or Spartans, but he was a brilliant strategist and politician. He knew how to exploit the weaknesses of his enemies, uniting disparate tribes under his banner. Thebes, one of the once great city-states, attempted to fill the vacant space. They saw themselves as new leaders capable of restoring their former glory. The Thebans, after their victory over Sparta at Leuctra, had for a time truly dominated the Greek world. Their generals, Epaminondas and Pelopidas, were brilliant, but their successes were temporary. Thebes, like Sparta, was a city-state with strong traditions, but it lacked flexibility. They were momentarily strong, but their hegemony was as fragile as Sparta's. Philip of Macedon observed these games with wise caution. He was in no hurry. He strengthened his army, trained it in new tactics, borrowing the best from his neighbours. His phalanx, armed with long spears, sarissas, was a formidable force. He understood that a disunited Greece, weakened by decades of war, would be easy prey. He skillfully exploited the tensions between city-states, offering alliances, promising protection, and then, when the time was right, striking. The polis system, the foundation of Greek civilization, began to crack. The idea of a self-governing city-state, which had given rise to so many great ideas and achievements, proved incapable of standing up to centralized power. Citizens accustomed to independence found it difficult to accept the authority of an external ruler. But economic decline, constant wars, and internal strife made this independence increasingly illusory. People grew tired of chaos. They craved peace and order, even if it meant submission. Philip of Macedon skillfully exploited this mood. He presented himself as the savior of Greece from internal strife and the external threat he himself had fanned. He spoke of Greek unity and the need to rise up against the Persians, who still remained enemies. His words resonated with many who saw in him a force capable of restoring Greece to its former glory. Thebes, feeling threatened by Macedonia, attempted to unite Greece against Philip. They saw him as a barbarian, a threat to Greek culture. Athens, despite its previous enmity with Sparta, also became wary. Democracy, though weakened, valued its independence. A temporary, fragile unity emerged in the face of a common enemy, but Philip was more cunning. He knew that his strength lay in his army, while the strength of the Greek city-states lay in their disunity. He used diplomacy, bribed, threatened, formed alliances, and then broke them. He was a master of the political arena. And when the decisive moment arrived, when the Greek city-states finally united against him, they were no longer strong enough. The Battle of Chaeronea, fought in 338 BC, was a turning point. Here, on the battlefield, two worlds collided. On one side, the united forces of the Greek city-states, on the other, the invincible Macedonian phalanx. Philip, who himself participated in the battle, demonstrated his military genius. The Macedonian army achieved a decisive victory. This victory marked the end of the era of city-state independence. The Greek city-states, which had fought for centuries for their freedom, found themselves under the rule of the Macedonian king. Thebes, as one of Philip's main opponents, was punished especially harshly. The city was destroyed, its inhabitants sold into slavery. Athens, although retaining its status, was forced to accept Macedonian hegemony. The decline of the polis system was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual decline. The great ideas of democracy, philosophy, and art born in these cities did not disappear. They merely found new space for development. The world was changing. The era of great city-states with their endless wars and rivalries was fading into the past. A new era was dawning, the era of empires, where the destinies of nations were decided not in city squares, but in the chambers of kings and on the battlefields of vast armies. Thebes, once a formidable power, became a mere reminder of its former glory. Its attempt to replace Athens and Sparta failed. Macedonia, under the leadership of Philip and then his son Alexander, became the new dominant power. It was a world where individual freedom gave way to order and discipline. But this order was built on force, and force, as history has shown, is often fleeting. The decline of the polis system was not only a political, but also a cultural shift. The focus shifted from the internal world of the polis to the wider Hellenistic world. Ideas born in Athens now spread throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, but in a new context. It was a time when old heroes departed the stage and new ones arose in their place, whose names were yet to be written into the annals of history. A new chapter was beginning, one in which the boundaries between peoples became blurred, and Greek culture, blending with Eastern traditions, gave birth to something entirely new. The decline of the polis system was not an end, but a transformation. The great legacy of Hellas was preparing for a new journey that would last for millennia. The silence that preceded the storm seemed to permeate everything. The wind died down as if holding its breath, and the sun, breaking through the veil of clouds, illuminated a scene where great empires had succeeded one another. Time, which until recently had flowed slowly like the waters of a stagnant pond, now gathered momentum. It seemed as if history itself, tired of the eternal confrontation between Athens and Sparta, had decided to speed up its pace, to more quickly usher the world into a new era. Gone were the days when the fate of the Greeks was decided in the agora, under the open sky, in heated debates among citizens. Now decisions were made in dark halls where generals and kings whispered, where the destinies of entire nations were weighed. Thebes, whose courage had recently astounded everyone, was now a pale shadow of its former glory, a reminder that even the mightiest force can prove fragile. Their attempt to replace the two giants had proved too ambitious. A new power was emerging on the scene: Macedonia. Philip, and later his son Alexander, brought with them a new reality. It was a world where individual freedoms, so highly prized in Athens, gave way to strict discipline and order. An order built on force which, as history had taught, was never durable. The decline of the polis system was not just a political shift, it was also a cultural one. The focus shifted. Instead of the closed world of each polis, the entire Hellenistic world now opened up to Greek thought. The ideas born in the golden age of Athens, the ideas of democracy, philosophy, and art, did not disappear. They merely embarked on a new journey, spreading across the Mediterranean to lands the Greeks had previously only heard of in legend. But this path was already different. Greek culture, mingling with ancient Eastern traditions, began to give birth to something entirely new, something unprecedented. It was a time when old heroes whose names resounded throughout the world faded into the shadows, giving way to new faces whose stories had yet to be written. The world was preparing for great changes. The boundaries between nations were becoming more blurred. The air was filled with the anticipation of something unknown. The great legacy of Hellas, without losing its strength, was preparing for transformation, for a new stage in its endless journey through millennia. The silence before the dawn of a new era was felt everywhere, in every rustle of leaves, in every breath of the wind. The lessons learned from the endless disputes of Athens, from the iron will of Sparta, from the tragedy of the Peloponnesian War, were not forgotten. Like seeds, they were carried by the winds of change, ready to sprout in new soil. Every city-state, every citizen, every warrior left their mark on this vast mosaic of history, and this mark, sometimes barely noticeable, sometimes vivid, lived on within us, in our aspirations, in our understanding of the world. Democracy, born in Athens, proved to be more than just a form of government, but an eternal ideal to which generations would aspire. Philosophy, which began its journey with questions about existence and knowledge, became the foundation for many world teachings. Art, which reached unprecedented heights in Greece, continued to inspire artists and sculptors throughout the centuries. These were not simply the achievements of the ancients, they were gifts they left to all of humanity. Spartan discipline, its ability to place duty above all else, resonated with those who valued order and fortitude. Even its aspiration for an ideal society, though never fully realized, served as a subject for reflection and experimentation. These contrasts, these opposites, so vividly revealed in the duel between the two great city-states, only emphasized the multifaceted nature of human nature and the endless search for a better path. Wars that once seemed endless were now perceived as harsh but necessary lessons. The Greco-Persian Wars, which united disparate city-states in the face of a common enemy, demonstrated the power of unity. The Peloponnesian War, which divided Greece, demonstrated the destructive power of internal conflicts. Each conflict, each victory and defeat left a deep mark on the collective memory. Even as the polis system began to decline, its spirit did not vanish. It transformed, adapted, and took on new forms. Ideas that had once been the preserve of a small group of citizens now became the property of the entire world. The Hellenistic period, which began with great conquests, was a time not only of the spread of Greek culture, but also of its enrichment. Eastern wisdom, African customs, all of this blended with the Greek heritage, giving rise to new philosophical movements, new forms of art, and new sciences. In every step, in every new discovery, echoes of the past could be detected. In the pursuit of justice, in the search for truth, in the desire to create a harmonious society, in all of this lived the great legacy of the ancient Greeks. They left us not only the ruins of majestic temples and statues, but more importantly, the seeds of ideas that continue to grow and develop. It was a time when the old order was crumbling, but in its place, something new was being born, something that carried echoes of bygone eras. The silence enveloping the world was not an end, but a harbinger of new changes, new discoveries, a new history that continued its endless movement, carrying within itself the wisdom of the ages. And this wisdom, like an invisible thread, connected us with those who lived thousands of years ago, reminding us that we are all part of a single, continuous flow of time. The decline of two great worlds, Athens and Sparta, seemed to mark the end of an era. But in reality, it was only the beginning, the dawn of a new era, where their legacy, their ideas, their lessons lived on, inspiring and guiding humanity. They became the foundation upon which new civilizations, new ideas, new aspirations were built. The silence that always precedes great change now enveloped the world. But it was not an empty silence, but a silence filled with anticipation. Anticipation of what the future would bring and of how echoes of the past would resonate in a new, unknown world. Time began its swift march once more, carrying with it only dust, but preserving for eternity the bright sparks of wisdom. A wind carrying the dust of centuries whispers over the ruins. Where once stood majestic acropolises and stern barracks, now only shadows dance in the rays of the setting sun. Two worlds, so different yet so connected, have left behind something more than stones and legends. This legacy is a thin thread threading the fabric of time, connecting us to the past. Athens, the cradle of democracy and philosophy, has faded like a candle flame ahead of its time. Its Acropolis, once shining with marble under the generous Hellenic sky, is now covered in centuries of dust. The Parthenon, a symbol of wisdom and beauty, stands like a ghost of its former glory. Streams of tourists, one after another, try to capture the spirit of Pericles, hear the echo of Socrates' debates, and catch the sparkle in Phidias's eyes. But the echo fades and the sparkle dims. The ideals born here, freedom of thought, a thirst for knowledge, a striving for harmony, live on, but in another, more complex world. Their light has dissipated, becoming part of the collective consciousness, invisibly influencing our notions of justice and beauty. Sparta, the military fortress, the embodiment of discipline and strength, has also faded into history. Its iron walls, once awe-inspiring to its enemies, have long since crumbled to dust. The hearth where warriors were forged, where children learned obedience and sacrifice, is now empty. But the spirit of Sparta, its unbending will, its devotion to duty, its understanding of the value of order, these too live on. Not in grandiose declarations, but in quiet steadfastness, in a willingness to defend what is dear, in the ability to make difficult decisions. The Spartan model of society, so alien to our modern values, nevertheless left its mark on the importance of structure, self-restraint, and collective responsibility. What remains of these two titans whose duel shaped the course of history? A contradiction remains that continues to haunt humanity. The Athenian desire for freedom and self-expression versus Spartan discipline and order. The yearning for ideals and beauty versus pragmatism and force. These two forces, intertwined in an eternal dance, shape our world. We seek harmony like the Athenians, but value stability like the Spartans. We thirst for knowledge and self-discovery, but understand the need for rules and boundaries. The decline of these worlds was not an end, but a transformation. Their ideas, their mistakes, their triumphs, all have become part of our shared past. We see in them a reflection of our own aspirations and weaknesses. In our quest for democracy, we remember Athens; in our desire for order, Sparta. But we also remember the fragility of ideals, the price of power, and the inevitability of change. The Peloponnesian War, a great conflict, left deep scars. The destruction of the Athenian fleet, devastating epidemics, disillusionment with gods and men, all these were bitter lessons. Spartan hegemony, a brief moment of triumph, demonstrated how easily power can corrupt and how fragile dominance based on fear is. Thebes, then Macedonia, Alexander, new powers replaced the old, but the foundation laid by Athens and Sparta remained. The sunset images we see now are not simply pictures of a dying day. They are a metaphor for passing eras, symbols of completion, but also a harbinger of a new dawn. The wind blowing across the steppe carries not only dust, but also the seeds of the future. It whispers that even after the greatest falls, something new is born. And in the silence enveloping these ancient lands, one hears not emptiness, but expectation. An expectation of how the echoes of two great worlds will continue to resonate in the hearts and minds of people, shaping their path. This is not just history. It is a part of our own soul, imprinted on the centuries. And so, when the last ray of sun touches the peaks of the Parthenon, and the weight of the shield lingers in the hands of Spartan warriors, the history of two great Hellenic cities reaches its natural end. There was no sudden end, only a slow fade, like the evening breeze dying after a day full of life. The wind that once fluttered the banners of Athens on the road to victory now whispers through the ruins, scattering the dust of centuries. The silence that envelops the Acropolis is not empty, but waiting for the echoes of their debates, their wisdom, their errors to once again find their place in the eternal dance of human memory. The duel between Athens and Sparta, which began with the clash of two worldviews, two paths of development, did not end with the fall of one or the rise of the other. It moved to another plane, becoming part of the fabric of our understanding of the world. We hear echoes of Athenian speech in discussions of freedom and justice. We sense echoes of Spartan fortitude when we seek support in difficult times. Their passions, their hopes, their tragedies, all of this is not buried beneath the stones of ancient walls, but lives on in our own aspirations and doubts. These cities, born from the sands of Attica and the mountains of the Peloponnese, gave the world more than just architectural monuments or military strategies. They left us a legacy of ideas that continue to shape our thinking. Democracy, born in the Athenian agora, continues its journey, evolving without losing its original impetus. Art, which reached its peak during the golden age of Athens, inspires to this day, reminding us of the beauty and harmony that the human soul strives for. Sparta's warrior spirit, its discipline and devotion to duty continue to inspire respect, reminding us of willpower and sacrifice. But at the same time, we remember the fragility of their greatness. We remember how easily ideals can be distorted, how power can become a temptation, and how strength can lead to ruin. The plague that devastated Athens and the cruelty that accompanied Spartan rule are not just pages of history, but warnings that resonate across millennia. They remind us that even the most brilliant civilizations are subject to trials, and that the path to harmony requires not only aspiration but also wisdom, not only strength but also compassion. When the last ships of the Athenian fleet sank in the blue Aegean Sea, when Spartan shields were covered in the dust of oblivion, history did not end. It simply shifted to a different rhythm. The wind blowing over Hellas carries not only the scent of sea and wormwood, but also the whisper of time, a whisper that every era has its dawn and its dusk, but that the seeds sown in the past continue to grow in the future. We stand on the threshold of new millennia, and in the silence of this moment, two voices echo. The voice of Athens calling for reason and freedom. The voice of Sparta, reminding us of duty and fortitude. These voices do not contradict each other, but complement each other, creating a complex symphony of human existence. Their opposition, their rivalry, their shared legacy, all this has become an integral part of our world. And when the evening glow paints the sky crimson, as if bidding farewell to the day gone by, we feel peace. The peace of ancient ruins, the peace of eternal memory. The story of Athens and Sparta is not a closed chapter, but an endless melody that continues to resound in our hearts, reminding us that even after the most brilliant triumph and the bitterest fall, there remains an eternal striving for light, for truth, for meaning. Their duel, now a myth, has become a source of inspiration, a mirror in which we see our own reflection. And in this quiet reflection, in this calm memory, lies their immortality.